In the assignment, you're going to work with Flask. Flask, what is that? That is a web framework for Python that it includes, even mostly for testing purposes, but all that you need to do here, a little web server. So you can just point your browser at it and then have a little web application written in Flask, and it can also serve up your files so that it works correctly. So the idea is what you're going to need to do is to basically take your web application, your front end that you have been working on already, and then add it to Flask. The way Flask works is that it has the ability to generate pages or content, but also to give you static content. Like your CSS files, your JavaScript file are just going to be served up by Flask without any modification. Of course, there's many of these frameworks, many of them in Python, and even more in any other language you can imagine. So some of them are Django or Web2Py. But yes, so we're just going to use Flask because it's fairly simple and straightforward. So how does Flask work in this structure? So Flask consists of a number of different parts, so to speak. So we have the library. This is the code that's already provided with you. That is run by Python. And through that library, it will actually allow you to respond to browser actions with some sort of response. Then it has the ability to have HTML templates. So you can actually have HTML documents where you can inject kind of data into it. So that's different from regular files in that it actually, when we have these templates, so regular files are not changed. These templates, they are actually allowed to be changed. There's also Python logic that is specific to you that you need to write. So the main thing you need to write is this Python logic and maybe an HTML template if you need that. Because you don't need that for your assignment. You can just write things that provide the JSON stuff. But if you want to make your page a little bit prettier and say, okay, you logged in at this particular time or something like that, you can. So how does this particular bit work? So in the end of the day, a Flask program is just a Python file. PyCharm actually has support for Flask, so you can create a Flask project all from scratch in Flask. But you don't have to do that, but it makes it easier. And you can use this virtual env system to basically make sure that it works anywhere and everywhere for your development. Where do you find your web page? Well, on localhost. Hopefully you remember from your networking that the special address 127.0.0.1 is special reserved address for the local machine named localhost. That name is also always mapped to this address by default. Yes, you can undo that and break lots and lots of stuff. Don't do that. But when we have our local host, we can then access this web server. One thing to remember is that it normally doesn't run on the port 80, the default HTTP port, but on another one. So you need to use a colon to specify the address. So how do you create a Flask application? Fairly simple. You create a variable, say app, say this is a Flask application with a particular name. You can also hard code your name if you want to. And then you say, okay, if we are in the main thing, then we run the Flask application. And that is how you can just run it. And yeah, you can configure it more if you want to, but you don't have to. Then we have the challenge of how are we doing routes. So how are we going to actually tell Flask where it needs to find what resources? And this is done through basically an annotation on a function. So when we look here, we see that we have the function welcome. And welcome, what it does, so this is the documentation of welcome. And this function just returns a button or a hyperlink in kind of partial HTML, I would say. And this is returned for the basically if you just have the top level URL. That's what this root says. And the root can just have URLs, but it can also have variable parameters in there. And the documentation also tells you exactly how to do that. So have a look at the documentation. That's very important. So this guessing page would then, for example, do guessing. So I have already added to the Brightspace the code for this guessing game, just as an example and a handhold for how you can get this going, so that you know something to start from. And I know it's not for this week for the exercise, but because we have a 3-week Easter break, it might make sense to have a go at it already amidst the Easter activities. So in this particular thing, what we see here in this function is that we have a global state. So we have this G, and then in that G we have this guess attribute that we set to empty. So we say, okay, before guessing we don't have a guess. And then we do this render template. The render template, what it does, it looks for this guessing.html file that we give as a parameter in the template directory, and then it basically goes through that template and it substitutes the relevant variables into that document. That way you can kind of mix and match your HTML with your Python code in hopefully the best way possible. And the G property is a special one that's available through Flask, so that it also becomes available to your template. So what does such a template look like? A template looks a little bit like this. So in this case we have a form, and there's a slide where it should have the full HTML tag, the title or the head and the title, and then the body, stuff like that. This kind of works, but it's a bit ugly. So what you can see here in this template is that we have the ability to substitute this guess variable. We saw that guess, okay, we put that as the value of the input. So if there's already a guess, we can reflect that again. And what we can also do, so if there is a message, we put that message in the parameter tag or paragraph tags. Yes, there's an empty tag there. And then we end this. So you can put quite some complex logic in there. This is what a template looks like in Flask. And kind of how you use Python logic in there.